Ashish Kothari has been active in environmental issues since 1979, when he was in high school, when he helped start the non-governmental organization Kalpa Vriksh, aimed at working on environmental and social issues on a local, national, and global level. He has studied sociology and taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration, Delhi. Additionally, he has continued to be active in Kalpa Vriksh and has also helped establish several networks providing alternatives to current systems of social well-being, justice, and democracy, with Vikalp Sangam in India and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives internationally.
Thanks to Travis for this opportunity. The backdrop to this series that you people are doing, and many of us are involved in the sort of processes we're involved in, is the multiple global crises that we're all facing. And of course, we know that they're intersecting. If it's climate, it is intersecting with issues of inequality and militarization and so on and so forth. If it's personal alienation and the sorts of health issues that people have across the world, it is also connected to ecological collapse and poverty, inequality, etc. So it's very important for us to look at these in an intersecting way and how they kind of reinforce each other. We also know from experience here, especially in the global south, that what has come in the form of development in the last few decades, especially which is based on unending economic growth and where GDP is the indicator of well-being, it has actually also come, it has of course benefited a lot of people, but it's also come with huge amounts of violence towards the rest of nature and towards people, especially those communities who are most directly dependent on nature and natural resources for their livelihoods, their survival, their cultural identity, and so on. But eventually, as violence to all of us. Here in India, for instance, the latest statistics show that the most so-called developed cities in the country, such as New Delhi, have millions of people who are dying or suffering from lung diseases and other diseases because of air pollution, because of so-called development of the modern transportation sector or the power sector, right? And finally, we also know that this model of development, economic growth-based development, is inherently unsustainable. There is no such thing as sustainable development, which the world is trying to tell us is a solution. And I'll come back into that in a minute. But we know from the latest scientific evidence and also evidence from indigenous peoples that planetary boundaries have been crossed, most of them. Others are in the process of being crossed. Whether you're in a local situation or globally, this kind of crossing of ecological boundaries is having a huge impact back on us, on the rest of nature and on people. And we just finished the 30th Conference of Parties of the Climate Convention, which has still not solved the problem. And we know that this is partly because of the fact that governments are not willing to move away from corporate capitalist-led development across the world. Until that is there is no solution to things like the climate crisis. Now, I don't want to go into more into the problem issues. We all know about them. And in any case, I don't want everybody to get depressed at the beginning of this webinar. There's already enough doom and gloom around. What I do want to focus on for the rest of the presentation is this question of, do we have alternatives? Are there ways of meeting human needs and aspirations without destroying the earth and without creating the kinds of inequalities and war and genocide that we're seeing across the world? And I say that there are, from experience in the last few decades, is that there are two kinds of alternatives. One, where people are saying enough is enough. We don't accept this model of development or this form of governance or this form of politics, which is creating these huge problems and dividing us as peoples and between us and the rest of nature, and based on the structures of oppression and unsustainability, whether it's capitalism or statism or patriarchy and so on. And in those forms of resistance, such as this particular image from about 40 years back in India, where indigenous people protested successfully against two mega hydroelectricity projects, what is very interesting is that the narratives are not just about, we don't want to be displaced, we don't want to be dispossessed, we don't want our forest to be drowned. That's there. But even more importantly, they're saying that whereas for you, this river is a commodity, it is about creating power and electricity. For us, the river is our mother. And as our mother, we will not allow this kind of treatment for the river or for the mountains or for forests or for each other, right? And you actually see this kind of narrative of both what we're saying no to, but also in some senses, what are the sort of alternative visions of how we relate to nature and each other in different movements across the world, whether it's the climate justice movements, the youth movements for environment and climate, the peace movements, the anti-racism movements, the movements for new constitutions, the farmers' movement in India against the commercialization of agriculture, and many, many more. But along with this, what's very important also is our response, the response of people's movements to what we think is right, not just what we think is wrong. And why is this important? Because the same system that has created the problems and has furthered it across the world is telling us, well, don't worry, we have the solutions. We'll do carbon trading, or we'll do this massive geoengineering projects across the world, and that will help to solve the climate crisis. Or we'll do net zero so that even if carbon is being released somewhere, we'll capture it somewhere else, and so on. And something like the whole movement across the world for electric vehicles is very much part of what the system is telling us is the solution. For most of us, this is not the solution. These are superficial and sometimes very dangerous ones, such as electric cars. You can see that the expansion of lithium mining or other sorts of mining processes across the world for this so-called transition into a climate-friendly society. So if these are not the solutions, what are the solutions? And here is where I want to get into a few examples of what's happening in different parts of the world where people, along with resistance, are coming up with ways by which they can meet their basic needs and aspirations, create livelihoods, create food security, etc., without destroying the planet. Just to give you a quick glimpse of some of these. This is from South Africa, an indigenous people which has been self-governing itself for the last 1,000 years. And in the last 20, 30 years, resisting the movement of the South African government to bring in mining, to allow Shell Corporation to come in with oil and gas exploration in their oceans, and all sorts of other so-called development projects. Because what they're saying is, you tell us you're bringing all of this because we are poor. But we're not poor. We have land, we have each other, we have the commons, we have the oceans. Our ancestors live in the oceans. And as long as all of this is happening, we are not poor, and we're not going to allow your notion of development to come in and destroy our ways of life. If you look at back here in India, an example of about 5,000 women farmers from the most oppressed section of India's society, the Dalits, the so-called untouchables or outcasts, who have in the last 35 to 40 years created an incredible agricultural revolution with going back to their traditional varieties of agriculture, going back to their own traditional indigenous knowledge, which is, by the way, not just modern science, and working with the land and holding the earth and seeds as sacred and collectivizing a lot of their operations, and through that creating food security for these 5,000 families. But then going beyond that and saying it's not just security, it's also sovereignty, that we have complete control as a community over everything to do with food, not corporations, not the government. If you go all the way across the world into the Peruvian highlands of the Andes, a somewhat similar movement in a very different cultural context with the indigenous Quechua communities who control their whole, what they call biocultural landscape, and have created also food sovereignty and local governance through all of that. There are thousands of examples actually of communities who have been either traditionally protecting the natural landscapes and biodiversity in which they live, or in new forms, also kind of trying to create ways by which they're able to protect that, and through that sustain or enhance their own livelihoods, their cultural identity, their political identity. If you think of self-governance and autonomy, perhaps the world's most famous example, justifiably so, is the Zapatista indigenous revolution in what is today called Mexico, where they have declared autonomy from the Mexican state, not separate state, but just an autonomous region where they govern using their own principles, which are incredibly democratic, but also working with the rest of nature. In Central Asia, in one of the most conflict-ridden, war-torn parts of the world, from where millions of people have had to flee, the Kurdish ethnic community has been trying to create a large zone of peace in the midst of this quadri junction between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, saying we don't actually want our own nation state, but we want freedom. We want autonomy. We want to be able to govern ourselves each individual settlement, but also across the landscape using confederations and alliances of self-governance and basing themselves on an eco-feminist principle or ideology called genealogy. Back here in India, a movement of the Adivasis in India, the indigenous people, to again create some form of self-governance by reclaiming their collective rights to their forests and their lands, and trying also to do internal changes. It's not as if communities are internally all sort of equitable and all of that. So there are gender issues in India, there are caste issues. So also creating the internal changes even as they struggle against against the imposition of programs and projects from outside. Over into Europe, in the midst of highly capitalist society, many examples of people, especially young people, creating non-capitalist forms of living, whether it's running a business, running a factory, running a school, creating communes in which people share their resources. People are not, everybody doesn't have their own cars and washing machines and so on. So trying to recreate community in the midst of an extremely individualized and atomized society, and then creating a relative self reliance in the midst of a very capitalist kind of society. These are all incredible examples that we can kind of learn from. And then over into Africa, a very inspiring example of 10 years of process between trade unions, environmental groups, feminist groups, etc., saying if South Africa has to do climate transition, it has to be a just transition, which is to say that the most marginalized peoples, the workers, and so on, have to be at the core of this transition and benefit from it. So what would that look like? So there's a very detailed work plan, blueprint that they've actually produced, which they're trying to get the South African government to accept, which is of course a very difficult thing, but nevertheless, as a process, very, very interesting to look at. Now, let me move into the final section of my presentation. So if you think of examples like this, and there are hundreds and thousands, and I could go on for many days with examples because I love listening to and telling stories. But moving into what are the sorts of broad frameworks of transformation? What are the broad sort of challenging, frameworks that can challenge the current notions of development and governance and politics and economy? So one way to think of this is if you take all those examples and fit them into various parts of this tool that we call the flower of transformation, where people are trying to do very different kind of politics, like the Kurdish and the Zapatista, where people are trying to create their own local self-reliance and food sovereignty or energy sovereignty, so economic democracy, where people are trying to work on issues of gender injustice or casteism or racism, right? Where people are trying to say that our forms of knowledge, not only modern science, but multiple different forms of knowledge, are what we need to be able to create the solutions that we want. And where people are then saying all of this has to happen in peace with the rest of the planet, which means that all species are to be equally respected. And then at the core of this flower of transformation, a set of ethics and principles. So just very quickly to go into each of these. In terms of politics, like I said, it's not about going to elections once in 4 years or 5 years and then hoping you select a party or a president who will do the right thing, and then if they don't, they wait another 4 years and create and elect a new one. It's really about people saying democracy is us taking power on the ground where we are the decision makers. In a village in central India, they came up with this slogan 40 years back saying that we elect the government in New Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. Nobody else will be taking decisions for us. So that form of what we call radical democracy is what is emerging in many parts of the world. Now, that has to go hand in hand with the democratization of the economy. So the arguments for food sovereignty, the arguments for collective control over the collective local control over the commons, the arguments for saying that if workers are the ones who are putting in all the value into production, it should be the workers who own the machinery or the land or whatever it is, not capitalist owners, right? And using all of that to say GDP or economic growth rates are a completely nonsensical indicator of development or well-being. We need to go into things like, does everybody have clean water to drink? Does everybody have clean air to breathe? Does everybody have a voice in decision making? Does everybody have good creative opportunities for learning? That's what are indicators of well-being, not GDP. The third component, or the third petal in this flower of transformation, is where women, for instance, or other gender minorities are saying we need to have equal rights, we need to have equal voice. Or those who are facing racism in different parts of the world, or those who are religious minorities saying we have to actually have equal rights to processes in the societies we live in. The fourth petal in this flower is about sustaining the incredible amount of cultural diversity and knowledge diversity that we have been lucky to have over the past many millennia, right? Much of which has unfortunately been erased in the colonial period, but still a lot exists. For instance, in India, we still have 780 living languages, not dialects, full languages, right? But teaching happens in only about 20 to 25 of them, which means we're actually actively erasing languages, and each language is a library of knowledge. So how do we sustain that diversity? Diversity of cuisines, diversity of languages, the diversity of ways of being, the diversity of faiths and ideologies. That is as much a part of this transformation. And then the decolonization of knowledge itself, right? There is no way in which people are in these movements will accept that modern science is the only form of knowledge that is acceptable. It is one form, but there are many other forms also. Even in the climate movement now, increasingly people are accepting that it's the combination of indigenous knowledge systems, modern knowledge systems, which will help us to actually understand the climate crisis better and then to deal with it. And the fifth and fundamental petal in that sense is the reintegration of human beings within nature. The last few hundred years of a certain form of Western modernity has kind of given us this impression that we are outside of nature, or that we are on top of some sort of a pyramid, and so we can do what we want with the earth and other species. But again, if we are to learn from what indigenous peoples have been saying, is that we are a circle of life. All species are equally to be respected, right? And if we think of it that way, then we begin to look at the rest of the planet in a very different form from what modern industrial societies have done. You can put all of these together into what emerges as a very interesting question and an approach that is also gaining ground, which is to also start asking questions about political boundaries. The world is today divided into about 200 nation states. There is nothing natural about these, right? And if you look at South Asia, which is what I'm familiar with, you have 7 or 8 countries which have been divided because of colonial or pre-colonial history, which has actually blocked natural flows, cultural flows, economic flows. A river is divided into 3 nation states, which means the upstream nation state can do what it wants with that river. It doesn't matter what happens to people downstream or to the wildlife in that river. And so, reimagining our political boundaries also from the perspective of what can be called biocultural regionalism or bioregionalism, re-establishing the ecological flows, the cultural flows, the economic flows is something that's also very much part of this transformation. And it's beginning to happen in some parts of the world. Now, as I said, at the core of this flower of transformation is a set of ethics and principles. Why this is important is because people often say, okay, can we replicate what's happening in, say, the Zapatista movement? Or can we replicate what the Dalit women farmers are doing in South India? And we always say that it's not really about replication because every place is different. But it's about learning what principles were used, what values were expressed in what people were doing, bringing that into our own context, and then saying, okay, how do we create our own transformations? So, what I'm putting up now is a set of values, principles, ethics that have emerged from these movements. These are not mine. These are what people have been telling us across in the last few decades from across the world. That you think of, for instance, the fourth bullet point here is that these examples of transformation are not about competition but about cooperation. They're not about privatization, but they're about the commons, both material and intellectual and spiritual commons, right? They are about the fact that physical labor, insofar as it is dignified physical labor, should be valued as much as intellectual labor. Why should a journalist writing about a farmer get more money than the farmer himself or herself, right? So it's that kind of transformation. It's about saying that happiness is not going shopping all the time. Retail therapy is a term invented by capitalists. But it's really about having opportunities for this kind of an exchange, having opportunities for learning, having opportunities to go and talk to the tree outside my house, and so on and so forth, right? Good food, and much more. It's about not just human rights, but also the rights of the rest of nature. And this is now a growing movement across the world of recognizing that rivers have rights, mountains have rights, gorillas have rights, not just human beings, and so on. So, and of course, peace, non-violence, and again, I'm sure Richard is going to speak much more about that. Now, if you put these sorts of values and principles, and I'm sure you can all add more together, what it comes up with is ideologies, philosophies, visions which don't celebrate money, power, and fame, which is unfortunately what today's world does, but celebrate life in all its different forms, right? So that one Dalit woman farmer who is feeding a family of 8 people on a small piece of land without destroying the earth, without any chemicals, using her own knowledge, is to my mind much more of a celebrity than a Elon Musk or a Bill Gates or any other such examples that you can think of. Because they are sustaining life, they're sustaining people and sustaining the earth. And that's what we really need. So, quickly to mention one example of such a worldview. This is from India. This is from ancient times in India, called Swaraj. Swaraj, very badly translated, means self rule or autonomy. What is important here is the combination of resistance to untruths, to coercion, to violence, etc., but also reconstructing or constructive alternatives to what we need. It is a combination of individual autonomy and freedom with responsibility for others. It is a combination of community rights and struggles and freedoms with responsibility towards the rights and happiness of other communities. And then what we've done is to actually extend that to say, if we were to extend this responsibility to all of nature, so we then call it eco Swaraj, or the term I've used is radical ecological democracy. Radical meaning going to the roots. All of us as decision makers in the collectives we are in, it could be a village, it could be a city neighborhood, it could be an educational institution, it could be an NGO, whatever. We are decision makers, but as we decide, we are also responsible to other people and to the rest of nature. Now, this shifts political power and economic power away from corporations and governments to ordinary people in their own collectives. And as I've given examples, this is happening in some parts of the world. There are similar worldviews across the world. Some are very ancient from indigenous peoples, like the first batch of terms that you see here from different parts of the world, and they're coming back in current struggles against extractivism and for alternatives. Some are radical reinterpretations of mainstream religions, because all mainstream religions are also extremely dogmatic and problematic, and we see what's happening with religious wars across the world. But there are reinterpretations from within of how to go back to the original spiritual roots of those religions, which are much more to do with compassion, solidarity, generosity, etc. And then some are worldviews emerging from within the belly of the beast, so to speak, from within capitalist societies, such as degrowth in Europe or ecofeminism in many different parts of the world. Right? Lots of questions for all of us. I mean, obviously, nobody has all the answers. If we have to move or want to move into this form of transformation, who will be the catalyst? The traditional sort of conventional leftist view has been it'll be political parties or workers' movements, and surely some of those are correct. But then there's a whole bunch of other actors, especially popular people's movements on the ground, community transformations that are taking the lead. Do we need a state at all, a centralized nation state? Or do we have other possible forms of governance that can actually take over, which are truly democratic? What would global governance look like? United Nations has been extremely useful for many things, but it has been a total failure with regard to some various things, serious things like climate or stopping wars and genocide, right? I mean, what's happening in Palestine right now, for instance. So, what would be a form of global governance that could be more effective where peoples of the world are represented, not just nation states? What would the business sector look like? Do we need a private business sector at all? Could it all be cooperative, workers' cooperatives? Is there some other form that would succeed in different parts of the world? How would universities change? Instead of having geography and biology and sociology and political science separately, can we have epistemologies and academics which are much more reflective of life, which is much more messy than these, individual compartments that we've made? And then what do you do about scale? We have a macro political and economic system bearing down on us, creating and furthering the current crises. How do we merge the thousands of examples of transformation, many of which are small, some are big, some are small, into networks which will be able to challenge that macro structures, right? And what I say is that it's not about upscaling any of these examples, which is the sort of corporate way of looking at it, or replicating. It's really outscaling. As I said, learn from each other, learn the principles, do it in our own way, and then network horizontally to create that scale. So let me end with talking about two processes that we have that we're part of, which tries to create this kind of networking and scale. One is in India. We call it Vikalp Sangam, which means the confluence of alternatives, getting people together across all these different themes and across geographies and cultures to work with each other, to do collective action, to share their knowledge and experiences, and to create a vision for themselves. What sort of a India do we want? To document. So we have a website which has about 2,000 stories of positive transformation from different parts of the world, to create advocacy things like people's manifestos for the elections and or also for ground level change. And then learning from this and connecting to similar networks in different parts of the world. In 2019, we launched this global tapestry of alternatives. It has all kinds of different groups there. There's feminist groups, ecological groups, peace groups, etc., youth groups from different parts of the world, trying to increasingly work together, create visions for a different world, do collective actions wherever possible, such as current just a couple of weeks back at COP30, and a lot more documentation of positive stories from various parts of the world. So this website actually has now several dozen stories of transformation from all over the world. There's a lot more in these two books. And this is on my last slide. The book on the right-hand side, Pluriverse, has got about 110 essays, about 90 essays on positive radical transformations in different parts of the world. It is now available in about 6 or 7 languages. I'll put the links in the chat when I finish. And the book on the left-hand side is an interesting experiment we tried a few years back of getting people who are familiar with different topics like gender, conservation, agriculture, food, education, health, to dream a vision of India in 2100, ideal utopian vision in that sector, and then say, how do we actually get there? Come back to the present and say, how do we get there? What are the opportunities? What are the hurdles? What are the pathways in order to get to that kind of a vision? And so talking about utopia, so whenever I actually make a presentation like this, people say, oh, this is fantastic vision, but then it's impossible. So why talk about it? I always put up this slide. I love it. It's a Argentinian filmmaker, Fernando Birri, quoted by the famous poet Galeano, which basically says, yeah, utopia, you're never going to reach utopia. It always runs faster, when you try and get to it. But that's the whole idea. At least you're trying to get there. You're making progress in some form or the other, moving towards a more positive, more just world. So that for me is where it's very important to have these visions, but also to be grounded in local community-led practice of the kind of examples that I've given. So I hope I've been able to give a little bit of a glimpse of the kind of transformations, especially political and economic and socio-cultural, that we need, many of which are happening, but much, much more obviously is needed for us to move towards a world that is much more just. Thank you.